Have you ever stopped to think about what happens behind those incredible Olympic moments you see?
Behind the scenes.
Yeah, the dedication, the sacrifices, the absolute drive it takes to reach that level of perfection.
But what if that path isn't as bright and shiny as it seems?
What if it's paved with something darker?
Exactly.
That's what we're going to be looking at today. This is a deep dive into the story of John Michael Lander.
He's fascinating, isn't he?
He really is. He's an Olympic-bound diver who went on to become an actor, an author, and an advocate.
A real Renaissance man.
Yeah, and we're going to use excerpts from a podcast interview he did to learn more about his journey.
And it really is quite a journey. He shows a side of elite athletics that most of us never even think about.
A much darker side.
A side that a lot of people would rather just ignore.
Yeah. And for anyone listening who has kids, especially kids with athletic ambitions, this story is something you need to hear.
It's a powerful reminder that even in the most celebrated places, there are still vulnerabilities.
And knowing about those vulnerabilities, it might just help you protect someone you love.
Absolutely.
So John's story starts out like a lot of classic tales of ambition and talent.
Right. Natural-born athlete.
Yeah, he was a natural in the pool, racking up win after win.
Even placed 8th in the Junior Olympics, if I remember correctly.
You do, that's right. But behind that success was a family facing some tough financial times.
And that's where things start to take a turn. That's where you see the cracks in that perfect picture.
It is. And that's when a lawyer steps in, a lawyer offering to help John reach his full potential.
Classic.
Right. He promises financial support to cover all of John's training, travel, the whole 9 yards.
A dream come true for a family struggling to make ends meet.
It seemed that way.
Yeah.
And John's mother, of course, wants what's best for him.
Isn't every mother?
So she sees this as an amazing opportunity, a chance for John to actually live out his dreams.
She had no idea.
None at all. And the lawyer, he was good, really good at what he did. He earned their trust, not just John's, but his mother's as well.
Well, that's how they operate.
Yeah, and he presents these meetings with professionals as a necessary step on the road to Olympic success.
But these meetings were far from professional, weren't they?
They were not. And this is where the psychology of it all gets really interesting.
Go on.
The lawyer, he didn't use force or intimidation. He didn't have to.
Much more subtle.
Exactly. He used something far more insidious. He used manipulation.
Preying on their hopes.
Absolutely. And for a 14-year-old boy, especially one who wasn't connecting with his own father, that attention, that support from the lawyer,
Filled a void.
it did. It was magnetic. The lawyer positioned himself as that missing father figure in John's life,
Taking him to dinners.
sharing heart to heart.
Taking an interest in everything John did. All classic grooming techniques.
He created this illusion of a special bond, making John feel indebted and obligated,
And isolated.
which is exactly how abusers operate. They become the sole source of support and validation, making it that much harder for the victim to recognize the manipulation, let alone break free.
It's a trap. A well-constructed trap.
It is. And tragically, this carefully crafted facade eventually crumbles, revealing a horrific truth.
Those meetings with those so-called professionals.
They were nothing like what John and his mother had been led to believe.
Parties.
Specific attire.
And John put on display, basically treated like a commodity to be bid on in a silent auction.
It's chilling. And this part of John's story is crucial because it exposes a really dark reality.
The reality of a network of abusers.
Operating within a culture of silence that allows these horrific acts to continue.
It becomes normalized.
And that's one of the most dangerous things. When abuse becomes normalized within a specific community or group, it becomes so much harder to break free.
Victims start to believe this is just how things are.
Exactly. And that's exactly what happened to John. He's repeatedly told this is just what it takes to make it to the Olympics.
A necessary evil.
If he breathes a word of it, he risks losing everything.
Losing a spot on the team.
Losing his dreams. Imagine the weight of that on a teenager's shoulders.
Fear, pressure, silence.
Trying to reconcile those Olympic aspirations with this horrifying reality.
It's a classic power play. Fear and intimidation keep victims trapped.
And John isn't alone in this. He talks about another figure, Dr. Richard Strauss.
The physician at Ohio State, right?
Right. He was later found to have abused hundreds of young athletes under his care.
A truly horrifying example of how institutions can fail to protect the most vulnerable.
Even when the warning signs are staring them right in the face.
It's a failure of epic proportions.
It is. John describes being taken to Strauss for all of his medical needs, even though there were closer options.
Special treatment.
Weekends at Strauss's house.
Another manipulation tactic, building trust and obligation.
And John already vulnerable and seeking approval.
He gets caught in the web.
He even tries to confide in his coach about what's happening with Strauss.
What did the coach say?
He dismissed him, told him it was just something everyone goes through.
To suck it up.
Yeah, just suck it up and move on. Imagine the betrayal, the feeling of being completely alone and unheard.
Heartbreaking. It just reinforces that feeling of self-blame that these abusers cultivate.
And John internalizes that message. He starts to believe he somehow deserves this treatment, that it's the price of admission to this elite world he wants to be a part of.
And that self-blame is tragically common in these situations. It silences victims and allows the cycle to continue.
And sadly, the adults in John's life, those meant to protect him,
They failed him.
they become complicit in the abuse, either through their silence or by dismissing his very real concerns.
This speaks to a wider societal problem, doesn't it?
It does. This reluctance to acknowledge and address these uncomfortable truths, especially when they involve respected figures or institutions.
It's easier to look away.
And for John, college becomes his escape route, a chance to break free from this toxic environment.
Thousands of miles away.
He chooses a university in California, hoping to reinvent himself and leave this all behind.
But as we'll see, escaping the past isn't that simple.
Not at all.
He thought he was safe, didn't he? California, thousands of miles away.
A fresh start. That's what he wanted.
But those so-called professionals, they still had a hold on him.
They did. They were covering some expenses that his scholarships didn't.
So even from a distance, they were still pulling the strings.
His mother had unknowingly given them a direct line to maintain that control.
It's a reminder that abuse isn't always physical. Sometimes it's financial. Sometimes it's emotional.
And it's just as powerful, just as damaging. John, meanwhile, he's trying to navigate college life.
Trying to blend in.
He describes himself as the Ice Prince,
Yeah.
pretty popular because of his athletic achievements. But he kept everyone at arm's length,
Guarded.
emotionally distant. It's a common coping mechanism, isn't it?
It is, especially for those who have experienced trauma.
They build walls to protect themselves.
But those walls sometimes make them a target for the wrong kind of attention.
Exactly. And that's what happened. A graduate student enters the picture, seemingly harmless at first.
Leaving little notes, right?
Yeah, little compliments, expressions of admiration, almost like a secret admirer.
Classic grooming behavior. Starting small to build trust.
John brushed it off at first, even shared some of the notes with his dorm mate, Sue.
But it escalated quickly, didn't it?
The notes became increasingly explicit and disturbing. The compliments turned into demands and threats.
And that map wasn't there.
The map leading directly to the graduate student's apartment.
That detail always sends chills down my spine. So calculated.
And John, still carrying the weight of his past trauma,
He was drawn in.
he goes to the graduate student's apartment. He's offered wine pressure to drink. And then
His memory goes blank.
a classic tactic used by abusers, isn't it?
It is. Alcohol lowers inhibitions, makes victims more vulnerable.
The fact that John can't remember what happened.
That's very concerning, raises the possibility of something more sinister.
He wakes up the next morning alone in a wooded area on campus,
Injured.
bleeding. And then the realization hits him.
He'd been assaulted.
Raped. There were claw marks on his chest. Physical injuries that couldn't be ignored.
Physical injuries that point to the brutality of that assault.
But the emotional and psychological scars,
Those are the ones that linger.
they run so much deeper. Rape is a violation that shatters your sense of safety, your sense of trust.
Leaving wounds that might never fully heal.
John stumbles back to his dorm, where Sue finds him.
Thank goodness for Sue.
She immediately takes him to the medical center.
But even there,
More trauma.
the medical staff weren't equipped to handle male rape victims.
Their response added insult to injury.
It's a reflection of the societal stigma that surrounds male sexual assault.
That boys don't cry mentality prevents so many men from reporting these crimes and getting the help they need.
It's a tragedy.
It is. John had already endured years of abuse, and then to be met with skepticism and judgment by those who are supposed to help.
It reinforces those feelings of shame and self-blame.
Makes victims question their own experiences, their own perceptions.
It tells them to stay silent, that no one will believe them.
Unable to cope with the trauma, John flunks out of college.
And who comes to take him home?
The lawyer. The very person who orchestrated this whole nightmare.
Placing John right back into the clutches of that abusive network.
John tried to escape through education, and he ends up right back where he started.
It highlights the insidious nature of these relationships.
The power dynamics that make it almost impossible to break free.
But John wasn't giving up.
No, his spirit wasn't broken. He enrolls in another university closer to home this time, Wright State.
And that's where he meets that dance professor.
She becomes a pivotal figure in his journey.
She saw through his facade, didn't she?
She recognized the pain he was hiding and offered him something he desperately needed,
Compassion.
a safe space to share his truth.
It's amazing how one person's empathy can make all the difference.
She asks him a simple question. What's going on?
And that's all it took,
It cracked through his defenses, and he was finally able to confide in someone.
at least partially.
It was a start. It was the beginning of his journey toward healing.
And that professor, she understood the control those professionals still had over John.
She helped him come up with an escape plan.
Acting.
He started acting first in college productions, and then he landed some small roles on TV shows.
General Hospital.
Exactly.
Acting can be incredibly therapeutic.
It can be, especially for those who've experienced trauma.
It allows you to step into different roles to explore emotions.
But even in Hollywood, John encountered those same toxic power dynamics.
Proposition.
Pressure to compromise his values.
Told to audition in his underwear.
It shows how pervasive this problem is.
It's a systemic issue, a cultural problem.
But despite all of that, John found some solace in acting.
He channeled his pain into his performances.
He found a temporary outlet for all of those emotions.
But temporary outlets aren't enough.
No, true healing requires confronting the root of the trauma.
Processing the pain, finding healthy coping mechanisms.
Eventually, John leaves Hollywood. He goes back to his roots, becomes a high school English teacher.
Hoping to use his experiences to help others.
And it's during this time that a particular encounter occurs.
An encounter that changes everything.
One of his students confides in him about an older boyfriend.
A boyfriend who is essentially supporting the student's family.
The student was only a sophomore in high school.
The parallels to John's own experiences were undeniable.
It was like looking in a mirror.
Seeing his own suppressed trauma reflected back at him.
John recognized the gravity of the situation
So he reported it.
to the school administration. But what he discovered next,
It was infuriating, wasn't it?
it was shocking. The school administration already knew about the relationship.
And they were okay with it.
They deemed it acceptable because the student's family was complicit.
They turned a blind eye.
They saw it as a family matter, a private affair. But for John, this was a blatant disregard for that student's well-being.
A normalization of exploitation that he couldn't tolerate.
And that's when everything changed.
It was a breaking point, wasn't it?
It really was. That moment, it ignited something in John.
He realized he couldn't stay silent any longer.
He knew he had to speak out, not just for himself, but for all the others who were still trapped in those same cycles of abuse.
And that takes incredible courage.
It does. He decided to leave teaching and focus on his own healing, to confront the trauma that had haunted him for so long.
He started with intensive therapy, right?
Yeah, he did. And it took some time. But he finally found a therapist who specialized in male sexual abuse trauma.
That's so important, finding the right therapist. Someone who truly understands what you've been through.
It is. Through therapy, John was able to start processing those years of abuse, to grieve the stolen innocence, to forgive himself for carrying the burden of shame and self-blame.
It's a long process, isn't it?
It is. It takes time and is painful, but it's essential for healing. John's therapist encouraged him to start journaling just to get all of those thoughts and feelings out.
A way to make sense of the chaos.
Exactly. And that journaling, it eventually led to something even more profound.
His book.
Surface Tension. It's a raw and powerful account of his experiences, a way to reclaim his narrative and inspire others to do the same.
And then there's his TED Talk.
Athlete Silence. That was a pivotal moment, not just for John, but for so many survivors who saw their own stories reflected in his words.
He stood on that stage so vulnerable, so courageous, sharing his truth with the world.
And the world listened. The response was overwhelming. It validated his decision to break the silence, and it sparked a much-needed conversation about abuse in athletics.
It led to the creation of Athlete Silence, didn't it?
It did. It's an organization dedicated to supporting athletes who have experienced abuse. It's a platform for advocacy, education, and empowerment.
Offering resources and a sense of community to those who often feel so alone.
Through Athlete Silence, John has become a leading voice in the fight against abuse in sports. He speaks at conferences, advocates for policy changes, and works tirelessly to create a safer environment for athletes at all levels.
His story is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the power of vulnerability, and the transformative impact of turning pain into purpose.
It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope can emerge and healing is possible.
John Michael Lander's journey is a call to action for all of us.
It is. It reminds us to be vigilant, to listen to and believe survivors, and to challenge the systems that perpetuate abuse.
It's about creating a culture where vulnerability is met with support, where speaking out is encouraged, and where accountability is demanded.
If John's story has resonated with you, we encourage you to visit Athlete Silence and explore the resources they offer. You are not alone.
And remember, John's story isn't just about abuse in athletics.
It's about power imbalances and the ways in which those imbalances can be exploited to silence and control,
It's a reminder to be aware of those dynamics in our own lives.
and to challenge them whenever we see them.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into John Michael Anders' story.
We hope it's left you feeling informed, empowered, and perhaps even inspired.
Until next time, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep diving deep.
We'll see you then.